All right, so we've got a pretty hefty stack of research here,
Yeah, it's a lot.
but it looks fascinating.
Mm.
I think we're going to be diving into some really interesting ideas today, kind of at the intersection of psychology and philosophy and even religion and politics.
It's a potent mix.
It is, yeah.
Hmm.
So the heart of our deep dive today is this interview with Professor Dr. Erol Göka, and it was featured in Kritik Baküş. You familiar with that?
Yes, I've read some of his work before. He's a prominent Turkish psychiatrist and intellectual.
Yeah, and he's got some really thought-provoking perspectives.
Looking forward to unpacking it.
So one of the things that really jumped out at me when I was going through this material was his idea that Turkey could potentially be the birthplace of what he calls a civilization of compassion.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he even sees Turkey as potentially playing a key role in shaping a new world order, one that's rooted in humanism and morality.
Wow, that's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah.
I'm curious to see how he builds that case.
Me too.
Hmm.
And one of the core arguments that he makes centers around this concept of the heart. Now, he's not talking about the literal heart organ.
Right.
He's using it as a metaphor for our moral compass, the center of compassion and ethical decision-making.
I see.
It's basically what he sees as the source of what makes us good humans.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. It's an interesting concept, especially when you consider how much modern thought emphasizes the brain, logic, pure rationality.
Right, and that's exactly Professor Göka's critique.
Yeah.
He's saying we've overemphasized that rational side of things, the brain, and we've neglected the heart.
I see.
So he asks this question: what happens when we try to navigate these really complex issues and these big societal challenges with only half the equation?
Yeah.
Only logic, no heart.
I see where he's going with this. So he's suggesting that relying solely on logic without that ethical and emotional grounding can actually lead us down a dangerous path.
Yeah, and he even argues that it creates a sort of spiritual and ethical void that leaves us vulnerable to manipulation.
That makes sense.
It's a fascinating argument. Now, I do wonder, though, wouldn't there be a risk in swinging too far in the other direction?
What do you mean?
Well, relying too heavily on the heart. I mean, after all, emotions can sometimes cloud our judgment, right? They can lead to irrational or even harmful actions.
That's true. Emotions are powerful.
Right.
But I don't think Professor Göka is advocating for some kind of pure emotionalism. It's not about throwing reason out the window. It's about finding a balance, a way to integrate both reason and compassion in our decision-making.
Okay, so you're saying it's not an either situation. It's not head versus heart.
Exactly.
It's both.
Yeah, it's both. And he believes that neglecting this balance has real-world consequences. We see it playing out in the rise of political polarization, social fragmentation, even the erosion of trust in our institutions.
So we've lost that connection to our shared humanity, our capacity for empathy and understanding.
In a way, yeah. And this is where his concept of justice comes into play.
Okay, how so?
Well, he suggests that each of us possesses what he calls an internal scale of justice. It's almost like this innate moral compass that guides our actions and our reactions, even when those actions might be perfectly legal or politically acceptable.
That's a really interesting concept.
It's,
It challenges the way we typically think about justice, doesn't it?
yeah, how so?
Well, we tend to think of justice as, a set of laws or external rules that are imposed by society.
Right.
External.
Right. But Professor Göka is saying that true justice goes deeper than that.
It's about aligning our actions with this inner sense of right and wrong.
Exactly. And that might mean going against the grain of what's considered normal or acceptable in a particular society.
So give me an example. How would this inner scale of justice play out in a real-life situation?
Sure. Let's say you have an opportunity to profit from a system that you know is exploiting other people. Now, legally, there might be nothing wrong with that. But your inner compass, that scale of justice inside you, might be telling you that it's wrong that you're contributing to an injustice.
Even if it's within the bounds of the law.
Exactly.
So we can't outsource our moral responsibility
Yeah.
to laws or political systems.
That's Professor Göka's point. He believes that true justice starts with cultivating virtuous individuals, people who can make these moral judgments independent of external pressures.
And then he ties this back to his idea about Turkey's potential, right?
Yeah, he sees Turkey's unique cultural blend, its history, as this bridge between East and West, as fertile ground for this kind of transformation.
Okay, so he envisions a system that prioritizes morality and encourages this kind of inner development.
Interesting. So if neglecting the heart is the problem, what's the solution?
Well, that's where compassion comes in. He believes it's the key to overcoming a lot of the challenges that we face today. political polarization, social fragmentation, even the dehumanizing effects of technology.
So he's saying compassion is the way to bridge that gap between head and heart.
Exactly. He sees compassion as this vital force that can help us reconnect with our shared humanity, foster understanding, build a more just and equitable world. I like that. But he also criticizes the way compassion is often understood, right? Particularly in Western thought.
Yes, he finds that the Western understanding can be limited, too focused on intellectual debate, and not enough on concrete action. He actually draws on thinkers like Schopenhauer and Art to make this point.
That's interesting. So he's pulling from diverse intellectual traditions to show that this idea of the heart isn't confined to any one culture or religion.
Exactly. It's this universal human capacity that needs to be nurtured.
Okay. I think we've laid some good groundwork here. We've explored Professor Göka's critique of this overemphasis on the brain, his concept of an inner scale of justice, and his belief of the transformative power of compassion. But how does he see all of this playing out on a larger scale?
That's where we delve into his critique of modern society and his vision for a new world order. It's quite a thought-provoking journey, to say the least. So picking up where we left off, it's really striking how Professor Göka connects this whole idea of neglecting the heart to the rise of what he calls these paranoid derbies.
Paranoid derbies.
Yeah, it's his term for these strongmen figures that kind of exploit people's anxieties in our increasingly complex, tech-driven world.
I see. So it's like when traditional values and genuine human connections start to erode, it creates this void that's easily filled by fear and manipulation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When people feel lost and uncertain, they're much more susceptible to those who offer these simplistic solutions and scapegoats,
Right. They're looking for someone to blame for their problems.
And this is where Professor Göka's argument about the limits of reason alone becomes so important. He's not anti-reason by any means.
Right.
But he is wary of what happens when reason is detached from empathy and ethical considerations.
So it's not enough to just be smart or logical. You need that moral compass, the heart, to actually guide your actions and to prevent you from being swayed by those who would exploit your fears for their own gain.
Exactly. He argues that we see this playing out not just in the rise of these authoritarian figures, but also in the increasing political polarization, the social fragmentation, the erosion of trust in institutions.
It's almost as if we've lost sight of what it means to be human, to connect with each other on a deeper level.
Yeah, I think that's part of his point.
It paints a pretty bleak picture, though.
Yeah.
Does he offer any hope? Does he see any way of reversing this trend?
He does, but it requires a pretty significant shift in perspective.
Yeah.
He's very critical of what he calls Western-centric thinking, particularly the way that it often frames the relationship between the West and the rest of the world.
So this kind of us versus them mentality.
Right. And he argues that this kind of thinking has contributed to this sense of cultural superiority and a lack of empathy for those who are perceived as different.
It reminds me of his discussion about Orientalism.
Yes, exactly.
This idea that Western cultures have often misrepresented and stereotyped Eastern cultures, and particularly Islam.
Right. He challenges that whole viewpoint. He calls for a more nuanced and balanced understanding of different cultures and their contributions to human civilization.
Okay, so it's about recognizing the value and the dignity of different cultures, even if they're different from our own.
Precisely. And this is where his belief in Turkey's potential really comes into focus.
How so?
Well, he sees Turkey with its historical and cultural connections to both East and West as potentially playing a key role in bridging this divide.
So it's not just about promoting compassion within Turkey itself.
Right.
It's about fostering a more compassionate and understanding relationship between different cultures globally.
Exactly. He sees Turkey as a potential model for a more harmonious world.
It's a powerful idea.
Yeah.
But how does he propose we get there? How do we actually move towards this civilization of compassion?
He doesn't offer a step-by-step blueprint.
Right.
But he does emphasize the importance of cultivating certain values and principles both individually and collectively.
Like what?
Well, one of the core principles he highlights is justice.
Oh, and we talked earlier about his view of justice as something that goes beyond just laws and external regulations, right?
It's about aligning our actions with that inner moral compass.
That scale of justice?
Exactly. He believes that true justice needs to be rooted in a deep sense of morality and empathy. It means recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of every individual.
Regardless of their background, their beliefs, their circumstances.
Precisely. It's about treating people with fairness and compassion, even when they're different from us, even when we disagree with them.
And this goes beyond just interpersonal relationships too, right? He's talking about a more just and equitable system on a societal level as well.
Absolutely. He believes this principle of justice should guide our political and economic systems. He argues for things like a more equitable distribution of resources, greater accountability for those in power, a commitment to social and environmental sustainability. All essential elements of a civilization of compassion, he would argue.
It's certainly a bold vision.
Yeah.
Do you think it's actually achievable? I mean, given the complexity of human societies and how often they seem to operate based on self-interest.
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
But Professor Göka, despite his critique of the current state of affairs, remains optimistic. He believes that by focusing on our shared humanity and cultivating compassion, we can actually move towards a more just and harmonious world.
He doesn't shy away from acknowledging the forces pushing in the opposite direction either, though, right? He talks about what he calls the technomediotic world.
Right.
And how technology can be used to manipulate and control people and further erode our sense of connection and shared humanity.
Yes, he's especially concerned about the rise of those paranoid derbies we mentioned earlier, those authoritarian figures who exploit people's fears and anxieties for their own gain.
Yeah, that is a pretty stark warning, especially when you consider how intertwined technology has become with our lives. Do you think he sees technology as inherently bad, though?
I don't think so. Not necessarily.
Well,
but he's definitely wary of how it can be misused. And it's not just about political manipulation either. He also talks about how technology can be used to promote consumerism, distract people from meaningful engagement, erode traditional values.
So it's not technology itself that's the problem.
Right.
It's how it's used and the values that it promotes.
Exactly. He's calling for a more conscious and ethical approach to technology, one that prioritizes human well-being and social connection over profit and control.
I see. So we need to be more mindful of how we're using technology and what its ultimate impact is on ourselves and on society.
Exactly. He believes technology can be a powerful force for good, but only if it's guided by those values of compassion, justice, and wisdom, the very values he sees at the heart of a civilization of compassion.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored Professor Göka's analysis of modern society and his vision for this different kind of world, this civilization of compassion. But what about the practical side of things? How do we actually put these ideas into action? How do we cultivate that heart and actually start building this more compassionate world he talks about?
Well, thankfully, Professor Göka doesn't just leave us hanging. He does offer some concrete steps we can take both individually and collectively to move in this direction.
Okay. I'm really interested to hear what he suggests.
And that's what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive.
All right, so we've explored a lot of Professor Göka's ideas, his critique of modern society, his emphasis on the heart, this vision for a civilization of compassion. It's all very thought-provoking stuff. But where do we go from here? How do we take these big ideas and translate them into action?
That's the challenge, isn't it? It's one thing to talk about these concepts, but it's another thing entirely to actually live them out in our daily lives.
Right. It all sounds great in theory, but what can we as individuals actually do to make a difference? What does this look like in practice?
Well, Professor Göka thankfully doesn't just leave us with these lofty ideals. He offers some practical advice. He suggests that we start by cultivating a more critical and reflective approach to the world around us.
Okay, so what does that mean exactly?
Well, it means questioning assumptions, challenging dominant narratives, and actively seeking out diverse perspectives, not just accepting things at face value.
So it's about becoming more aware, more conscious of those forces that are shaping our thoughts and our behaviors.
Exactly. Those subtle influences that we often just take for granted.
Right, like the media or our social circles or even our own cultural background.
Precisely. He suggests that we need to develop a more discerning mind, a mind that can distinguish between what's truly beneficial and what's merely appealing or convenient in the moment. He even encourages us to turn that critical lens on our own cultural assumptions.
Which ties back to his point about Western-centric thinking. Right?
Exactly. Remember, he sees that as a major obstacle to building a more compassionate world.
Right, because it can lead to a sense of superiority and a lack of empathy for those who are different.
Precisely.
So how do we apply this on a personal level? What can we do in our own daily lives to cultivate this heart, this inner compass he talks about?
Well, he really emphasizes the importance of striving for excellence in all our endeavors. And I don't just mean in our careers or our personal pursuits,
Right.
but in every aspect of our lives.
So it's about becoming the best versions of ourselves that we can be.
Exactly. It's this ongoing process of self-cultivation, a commitment to becoming more compassionate, more wise in our thoughts and actions.
And this resonates with his emphasis on personal responsibility too, right?
Mhm.
He's not just advocating for systemic change.
Right. He's calling on each of us to take ownership of our own lives and our impact on the world.
So it's about recognizing that we have the power to make a difference right now in our own spheres of influence.
Exactly. It's not about waiting for governments or institutions to fix things. It's about taking action ourselves. It's about making wise choices, acting ethically, contributing to the well-being of our communities in whatever ways we can.
It's kind of like an inner revolution in a way, right?
Yeah.
A transformation of the self as the foundation for building a more compassionate world.
That's a great way to put it.
But he also acknowledges the importance of collective action too, right? We can't create lasting change through individual efforts alone.
Absolutely. He recognizes that we need to work together to create more just and equitable systems, to hold those in power accountable, to promote policies that reflect the values of compassion and social responsibility.
So the two-pronged approach then, inner transformation and outer action.
Right. Personal responsibility and collective effort.
A holistic approach to creating a more compassionate world.
Exactly.
It's definitely an ambitious vision.
Yeah.
But after diving into Professor Göka's ideas, I have to admit, I feel a sense of hope. He reminds us that even in a world that often feels driven by fear and self-interest and division, there's still room for compassion. There's room for connection. There's room for building a better future together.
I agree. It's a powerful reminder that change is possible. But it starts with each of us. It starts with cultivating that heart, that inner compass that guides us toward a more just and compassionate and ultimately fulfilling way of being in the world.
And maybe, just maybe, as Professor Göka suggests, Turkey can play a unique role in leading the way, demonstrating that progress and compassion aren't mutually exclusive, but they can actually reinforce and enhance one another.
It's a vision worth striving for, would you say?
Absolutely. Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive. I want to thank you for joining us on this journey. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep cultivating that compassion within yourselves and the world around you.